Okay, here's how you do hyperextensions, okay? This is a hyperextension machine. It's gonna work your hamstrings, your glutes, your spinal erectors, your whole posterior chain, all the muscles basically from your back right the way down to your heels nearly, okay, depending on how you do it. Number one thing is where you set up the pad, okay? Depending on how long your legs are, you're gonna set up the pad slightly differently, meaning that if I had very, very short legs, I'm gonna set the pad down nice and low. If I have longer legs, I'm gonna set it up nice and high. But what it really matters, the only thing that really matters for you setting it up for your own individual leg length and your anatomy and so on, is the gap that there is between this part of the pad and my hips, okay? So if I have it down nice and low where it is, like here for example, okay? There's just slightly too big of a gap between the bottom of the pad and my hips. So I do want a bit of a gap, but that's slightly too much. So what I'm gonna do here is I'm going to increase the height slightly, if this thing will move for me. Still a little bit low. So increase it again, find it to where my feet are now hooked in and there's a slight gap here to allow me to go over the pad, but it's not down too low, okay? So that's where you want it to be. You want that pad to be just underneath the line of the hip to allow you to freely bend over the top of it without it restricting you, okay? To actually set it up, first thing, hands on the pad like this. Tuck your heels in to the back of the machine like this, okay? That's gonna prevent you coming out of the machine. I'm gonna sit myself over the pad like this and I can get a hold of these handles just to feel comfortable for the moment. This is an exercise that in terms of actual execution is not that hard, but people overthink it. People really, really freak out when they're doing hyperextensions because they have this idea that when they lift their hands, they're suddenly gonna headbutt the floor. Your core and your spine and your hamstrings and your glutes are all a lot stronger than you think, okay? So whenever you're sitting in this position here on a hyperextension, don't be under the illusion that if you remove your hands, you're just gonna collapse. You will not. You will be quite comfortable holding yourself in this position like this, okay? How I actually do it is all I'm really doing is I'm bending at the hip over the top of the pad like this until I feel a little bit of a stretch in the back of my hamstrings and the glutes. And then I'm gonna drive by squeezing my glutes, my arse, into the pad to come back up again, okay? That actually was a wee tiny bit too high for me. So there's an example of how you need to adjust things set to set if it doesn't feel comfortable. I'm gonna guess now that now there's probably actually a slightly better gap. So hands across the chest, over the top of it like this until I feel a good stretch in the hamstrings, driving up, squeezing through. I'm squeezing my hips, my glutes into the pad at the top. Down nice and slow like this here. Good stretch in the hamstrings, driving back up into the glutes like that, okay? Couple of key points in that, okay? Number one, if you do not feel comfortable with it initially, you can feel free the first couple of times of doing it as either just holding this position to develop a bit of confidence in yourself to actually hold the position, or if you want to, only go down very, very slightly. Or if you want to, have something in front of the hyperextension machine, like a little small box or a hip thrust pad or something like that, so that you're confident that whenever you're, say, here, for example, if there's something in front of you, you at least know that if you then couldn't come back up, that there's something in front of you to actually put your hands on, okay? Pause that 1 second. Okay, number two thing you want to think about is whenever I'm actually going down into the stretch at the bottom of the movement, I want to push a little bit deeper into the stretch each time if I can. So down like this here, hitting a point of stretch, linger in it, and I'm going to drive back up and squeeze through. Whenever I go down again, I'm going to try and push ever so slightly further if I can into the stretch. Back up again, okay? You also want to make sure that you're not rounding your back during the movement. What that means basically is whenever I'm actually going over the top of that machine, I want my spine here to be quite rigid and straight. I'm bending over the top of the pad like this here. I'm only bending at the hip. I don't want this to happen where I go over the pad and then I start to round at the back. That's not ideal, okay? So try to make sure that if at all possible, your back's not rounding a huge amount while you're doing it, okay? The final thing that I want you to take into account, the final mistake you want to avoid, is going too far on the way back up. So what people will do is they'll start off here, go down into a nice stretch, drive back up, and then come back here like some dolphin trying to fucking come out of the water. You're only going back up to a nice straight line, okay? There is my finishing point. I'm using a mirror here to judge myself. Hopefully if you're using one, there may be a mirror available. You can kind of judge or you can even record yourself. You want to be nice and straight at the top, okay? So, main things to avoid, just to kind of summarize it for you. Number one, trying to go too far at the beginning. If you need to take a bit of time just to become comfortable with it, that's fine. Number two, make sure that your spine doesn't round too much. You're trying to bend at the hip and stretch the hamstrings and the glutes. You're not trying to stretch out your back, okay? Number three, make sure that you're not flying too far up on the way back up, okay? So whenever you're going down, you're taking your time. you're coming back up, you're only going to that point of straight, okay? Number 4, take your time. Relax with it, don't try and overthink it, just take your time, put a box in front of you if you need to, if you don't feel comfortable with it. If it's still a struggle, we can substitute it for something else if we need to, okay? In terms of execution, simplified, feet hooked in, number 1, pad set up at the right height, number 2, over the top of it like this till you feel a little bit of a stretch, driving the hips in like this, squeezing and holding for a second, back down again, nice stretch in the hamstrings and the glutes, driving through again like that, okay? Pretty simple movement when you get the hang of it. Then you cut that down as far forward.